Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening where the shadows grow long and the world outside softens into a gentle hush. I find myself wondering, as the hours slip by, where in this wide world are you listening tonight, and what sort of weather taps against your window pane as we settle into our shared solitude. Here, in the heart of London, a persistent rain sweeps across the slick cobblestones, carrying with it the muffled, rhythmic clatter of horse hooves fading softly into the thick, enveloping fog. Let us step in from the damp chill and ascend the worn steps to the familiar sanctuary of 221 B. Baker Street, a room suspended in time and rich with the lingering comforts of home. A brilliant fire crackles merrily within the iron hearth, throwing dancing ribbons of orange and gold across the cluttered room, illuminating the spines of leather-bound books. The air in this cosy parlour is heavy and warm, carrying the deep, earthy aroma of a freshly lit pipe mingled with the subtle, dusty sweetness of old paper and the dark scent of steeping tea. It is the perfect sort of evening for a tale, an evening when the gas lamps hiss softly against the creeping gloom, sealing us safely away from the shivering shadows of the city. Make yourself entirely comfortable as the firelight warms away the chill of the day, allowing the steady rhythm of the rain to wash over your thoughts, while we prepare to unravel the strange and sorrowful mystery of the portrait with bleeding eyes. The evening had settled over the sprawling metropolis of London like a heavy and suffocating mantle of damp velvet smelling deeply of wet cobblestones, river fog, and the bitter, comforting ash of coal smoke. The rain, relentless and mesmerising, tapped a restless, rhythmic code against the soot-stained glass of our sitting-room window at Baker Street, each drop a small, liquid percussion that seemed to deepen the profound, insulating quiet within our walls. I sat deeply settled in my customary leather armchair, listening to the soothing, gentle hiss of the fire as it greedily consumed a particularly resinous block of coal, the amber and gold light dancing across the worn, gilded spines of my medical texts, and the scattered, chaotic snowdrift of papers belonging to my companion. Holmes was a creature entirely composed of shadow and quiet contemplation this night, folded into the deepest corner of his settee, his long, thin limbs drawn up in a posture of profound, statue-like stillness. A thick, curling cloud of fragrant, sweet Virginia tobacco drifted continuously from the charred bowl of his dark briar pipe, floating upward to mingle with the persistent scent of damp wool and old, crumbling parchment that forever haunted our comfortable rooms. The world outside the heavy drawn draperies was a cold, unforgiving labyrinth of slick streets and blurring gaslights, filled with the muffled, splashing clatter of occasional hurried hansom cabs and the distant, mournful, echoing whistle of a lonely riverboat navigating the dark, churning waters of the Thames. Yet inside our sanctuary, there was only the slow, deliberate, heart-like ticking of the brass mantel clock, measuring out the peaceful, unhurried hours of a domestic evening. It was a night meant for silent companionship, for allowing the exhausted mind to drift gently upon the slow, rolling tides of memory and shared history, until the heavy, jarring thud of the street door far below sent a faint, shivering tremor through the oak floorboards beneath my feet. The sound was an abrupt intrusion, entirely out of place in the sheltered, suspended calm of our quiet evening, and it was followed almost immediately by the unmistakable shuffling rhythm of hurried, painfully hesitant footsteps, ascending the 17 wooden stairs to our door. I looked across the warm hearth to Holmes, whose eyes remained firmly closed behind the veil of curling blue smoke, though the tempo of the perfect rings he blew into the still air quickened ever so slightly, betraying an awakening, sharpening interest in the impending disruption of our solitude. A soft, almost apologetic knock from our landlady was all the scant prelude we received before the door creaked inward on its brass hinges, admitting a sudden, sharp gust of cold, rain-scented air and a solitary figure who seemed to carry the very essence of the raging storm within his trembling, exhausted frame. He was a young man of perhaps 30 years, though his face was drawn and pale as forgotten parchment, hollowed out by a terror so profound and deeply rooted that it seemed to vibrate in the very air surrounding him. Freezing water dripped heavily from the sagging brim of his crushed felt hat, and ran in dark, glistening rivulets down the velvet collar of his expensive but thoroughly dishevelled Ulster coat, pooling silently and spreading a dark, damp stain upon the woven Persian rug beneath his mud-spattered boots. He clutched a large, flat, rectangular object, wrapped tightly and haphazardly in thick black oilcloth to his chest, holding it with the desperate white-knuckled, unyielding grip of a drowning man clinging to the last piece of shattered driftwood in a churning, violent sea. Holmes did not speak a single word of greeting, but gestured languidly with the amber stem of his pipe toward the empty, welcoming chair positioned directly opposite my own, the leaping firelight catching the sharp, aquiline, patrician angles of his profile as he silently invited the shivering, haunted stranger to step out of the cold darkness and into the forgiving warmth of our domestic hearth. I rose at once, driven by a physician's ingrained instinct to offer comfort, as to pour a cup of hot tea from the heavy silver pot that rested upon the iron trivet near the glowing coals, the fragrant, calming steam rising in a billowing cloud of bergamot, damp earth, and rich Ceylon leaves. The young man collapsed into the waiting chair with a heavy, breathless sigh, taking the fragile porcelain cup with hands that shook so violently the matching saucer rattled like dry, hollow bones in a crypt, his teeth chattering a disjointed, frantic rhythm against the delicate rim as he swallowed the scalding liquid. He introduced himself as Arthur Pendleton, his voice little more than a frayed, broken whisper, his desperate words tumbling over one another in a frantic rush, as if he genuinely feared the flickering shadows gathered in the corners of our room might somehow rise and silence him, before his terrible tale could be fully told. He spoke of an ancient, sprawling family home situated impossibly far away from the comforts of the city, perched precariously upon the desolate, wind-scoured, heather-clad moors of the north, a forgotten place where the silences were impossibly deep and the shadows clung to the damp grey stone walls like living, breathing entities. He spoke with a trembling, fearful reverence of his ancestors, generations of men and women possessing severe, unforgiving countenances who gazed down from the shadowed, echoing galleries of the sprawling manor, their lives long extinguished by the ruthless passage of time, yet their oppressive presence lingering heavily in the draughty, twisting corridors and the groaning floorboards, and then, with a swallow so agonizingly painful I could almost feel the tight constriction in my own throat, he spoke of the portrait, the cursed, ancient heirloom that had hung entirely undisturbed in the dust-choked western wing for over a century, a forgotten relic of a dark family history. He explained in a breathless whisper how the long, bitterly cold and perpetually dark nights of the passing, relentless winter had somehow awakened something terrible, something unspeakably malignant within its cracked and varnished depths, transforming a mere piece of painted canvas into an instrument of ceaseless, waking nightmare that had driven the servants to flee blindly into the moors and left him entirely alone with a weeping ghost. Arthur Pendleton set the empty teacup aside with a trembling hand, the fine porcelain clicking sharply against the polished wood, and placed his heavy, oilcloth-wrapped burden upon the low mahogany table, situated exactly between our three chairs. His pale fingers lingered on the damp black fabric with a complex, agonizing mixture of familial reverence and absolute, sickening revulsion, as if touching the skin of a deceased serpent that might still possess a venomous, lethal bite. Slowly, agonizingly, with ragged breaths that hitched and caught painfully in his chest, he began to peel back the layers of protective, waterproof cloth, releasing a sudden, pungent smell of old, settled dust, decaying canvas, and drying varnish that rose heavily to meet the sharp, metallic tang of his wet wool coat and the sweet, clinging aroma of Holmes's tobacco smoke. The bright fire seemed to miraculously dim in the iron grate as the final clinging fold of dark cloth was cast aside, revealing a heavy, elaborately ornate frame of tarnished, blackened gilt that securely held within its borders a portrait of a stern, impossibly pale woman, dressed in the severe, high-collared, mourning fashion of a bygone, forgotten era. Her painted face was a masterful, chilling study in aristocratic disdain and cold superiority, rendered with an undeniable, brilliant skill that perfectly captured the cold, pearl-like luminescence of her skin and the intricate spiderweb delicacy of the black lace tightly gripping her throat. Yet, it was not her icy, arrogant demeanour or the oppressive, heavy darkness of the painted background that drew the breath from my lungs in a sharp, involuntary hissing gasp. It was the absolute creeping horror of her eyes. From the inner corners of those beautifully painted, flatly staring, unblinking grey eyes, twin, jagged tracks of thick, wet, gleaming crimson had been freshly traced down the pale canvas cheeks, staining the painted delicacy of the lace at her collar and gathering in a dark, pooling, viscous stain at the lower edge of the wooden frame. The blood, or whatever unholy, thick substance was perfectly mimicking it, was still profoundly wet and viscous, catching the flickering, dancing light of the hearth fire in a way that made the painted dead woman appear to be presently weeping fresh, agonizing, continuous tears of deep, horrific, bottomless sorrow. The young client pressed his shaking hands to his pale face, and began to weep silently, heavily into his palms. The sound of his ragged, broken breathing, the only noise remaining in a sitting room that had suddenly grown freezing cold and entirely breathless. Holmes did not utter a single syllable of comfort or surprise, but rather uncoiled his long, thin frame from the depths of the settee with the slow, deliberate, terrifying grace of a nocturnal predator, catching the faint, copper scent of the hunt upon the night breeze. His long, dark shadow fell heavily over the weeping portrait, obscuring the woman's face as he knelt carefully beside the low table. His sharp, intelligent eyes narrowed to mere glittering slits as he brought his own face to within a single, perilous inch of the ruined canvas, the sharp tip of his nose nearly brushing against the glistening red, wet tracks. He drew his heavy silver magnifying glass from the deep pocket of his woolen dressing gown, the thick curved lens capturing and bizarrely distorting the surrounding firelight as he slowly, meticulously traced the irregular path of the crimson tears from the painted flat tear ducts all the way down to the dark, coagulating, sticky puddle, ruining the bottom of the gilded frame. The heavy silence of the room stretched out, fragile, tense and absolute, broken only by the continuous hissing splatter of the freezing rain against the windowpane and the faint, rhythmic, unceasing ticking of the mantel clock, until Holmes reached out a long, impeccably clean, pale finger and gently, almost tenderly, with the utmost caution, touched the thickest, wettest part of the red pigment. He lifted his stained finger to the amber light of the nearest gas lamp, slowly rubbing the thick, resistant substance between his thumb and forefinger to test its strange, clinging consistency, before bringing it directly beneath his nose and drawing a long, slow, profoundly deep breath into his lungs. Immediately, a heavy, cloying, fiercely metallic odour began to aggressively fill the small, intimate space between the three of us, a scent so sharp, so ancient, and so entirely unmistakable that it cut straight through the comforting, civilized aromas of the spilled tea and the burning tobacco, settling deep in the back of my throat with the undeniable, sickening taste of a rusted copper penny. It was the heavy, visceral, ancient scent of raw, oxidized iron and bodily salt. The dark smell of a slaughterhouse floor carried unexpectedly on a cold, bitter winter wind, the terrible, undeniable, primal perfume of violently spilled life. Holmes wiped his long fingers meticulously clean upon a pristine white linen handkerchief drawn from his sleeve, his sharp features remaining entirely, frustratingly impassive, though a dark, brilliant, calculating fire had clearly begun to burn deep within the fathomless grey depths of his restless eyes. He looked up from the ruined painting to the trembling, broken client, his voice a low, soothing, resonant hum that seemed to gently vibrate in the very air of the room, promising an unwavering, relentless pursuit of the hidden truth, no matter how deep, twisted, or dangerous the darkness might eventually lead us. He stated with a calm, absolute certainty that sent a long, freezing shiver racing down the entire length of my spine, that the weeping pigment spoiling the canvas was no clever parlour trick of mixed oils, crushed madder, or artist's turpentine, but pure, unadulterated human blood kept inexplicably fresh and continuously flowing through a hidden mechanism or method, as diabolically ingenious as it was profoundly, sickeningly wicked. The very shadows gathered in the corners of our room seemed to lean closer, listening attentively, as Holmes declared with a sudden decisive snap of his silver pocket watch that there was not a single moment to be lost to hesitation or fear, that the weeping portrait resting upon our table was merely the opening prologue to a much larger, darker and more impending tragedy. He announced that we must gather our warmest travelling cloaks and depart immediately, some leaving the safe, burning hearth of London behind to travel into the unforgiving night toward the distant, lonely, weeping moors where this bloody canvas had first been born into the world. The transition from the warm, tobacco-scented sanctuary of Baker Street to the sprawling, cavernous, echoing iron ribs of Paddington Station was a disorienting blur of flashing gaslights, slick, rain-washed cobblestones, and the rhythmic, hollow clopping of our hired cab horse, pushing valiantly through the freezing, relentless downpour. We secured a private first-class compartment on the Midnight Express heading north and west, the heavy, polished door sliding shut with a final solid click that seemed to firmly and irrevocably sever our connection to the known civilized world, sealing us within a narrow, swaying room of worn green velvet and polished dark mahogany. The mighty steam locomotive lurched forward with a deep, groaning shudder that vibrated through the floorboards and deep into our weary bones, slowly gathering a relentless, driving momentum as it pushed out of the tangled, sprawling web of city tracks and plunged headlong into the absolute suffocating blackness of the sleeping English countryside. The rhythmic, mechanical clatter of the heavy iron wheels rolling endlessly over the steel tracks became a steady, hypnotic metronome, a ceaseless, driving heartbeat accompanying our silent vigil as the dark, unseen miles rolled away into the creeping mist, the driving rain occasionally lashing against the thick glass of the compartment window like handfuls of aggressively thrown gravel. Holmes sat perfectly motionless in the dim, flickering amber light of the carriage lamp, the thick collar of his heavy woolen travelling cloak turned up high against the persistent creeping draughts, his eyes closed in deep, impenetrable meditation, while the securely wrapped portrait rested on the empty velvet seat beside him, an unseen passenger carrying a heavy cargo of silent, bloody sorrow. I found the sweet release of sleep entirely impossible, my exhausted mind endlessly circling the horrific, vivid image of the bleeding canvas and the sharp, coppery scent of the fresh crimson tears, my overactive imagination populating the passing, unseen darkness beyond the wet glass with phantom manners, crumbling stone walls and generations of severe, pale faces watching us from the creeping shadows. Hours bled slowly into one another, marked only by the occasional, indistant wail of the train's steam whistle tearing violently through the night air, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to perfectly echo the profound isolation of the remote, desolate destination that patiently awaited our inevitable arrival at the end of the line. When the heavy, exhausted train finally ground to a squealing, hissing halt at the lonely, windswept rural station, the vast expanse of the sky was just beginning to bruise with the first, weak light of a pale, hesitant grey dawn, offering absolutely no warmth and bringing no comfort to the freezing, desolate landscape that stretched out endlessly before us. We stepped down onto the rough, splintering wooden planks of the deserted, silent platform, the bitter, unhindered wind immediately biting viciously at our faces and tearing at our heavy clothes, carrying with it the undeniable, deeply lonely scent of damp earth, crushed purple heather, and the vast empty miles of the rolling, unforgiving northern moors. A solitary, battered carriage summoned by a hurried telegraph sent during the briefest pause in our journey waited patiently in the swirling, freezing mist, the tired horses stamping their heavy hooves restlessly against the hard ground, their breath rising in thick white plumes that mingled seamlessly with the fog clinging heavily to the dark earth. Arthur Pendleton ushered us inside the cramped interior without a single spoken word, his face pale and drawn tight with renewed, suffocating dread as the carriage lurched forward on its creaking springs, leaving the meagre, fading comfort of the isolated station behind to begin the slow, punishing ascent into the jagged, treacherous hills. The journey was a silent, agonizingly slow procession through a landscape entirely devoid of protective trees or welcoming shelter, a vast, undulating, freezing ocean of muted grey and dead brown, where the silence was so profound and absolute it physically pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the sharp snapping of the driver's whip and the lonely, hollow wind continuously mourning over the hidden, treacherous bogs. As the meagre, watery morning light slowly strengthened, casting long, twisted, unnatural shadows across the rugged, unbroken terrain, the thick mist finally began to part like a torn, ragged theatre curtain, revealing the dark, looming, jagged silhouette of an immense stone manor crouched defensively at the very edge of a deep, black ravine. It was a place of oppressive, heavy darkness, its narrow, soot-stained, leaded windows staring out across the empty, rolling moors like blind, unfeeling eyes, silently welcoming us to a forsaken home where the very damp walls seemed to whisper with ancient, unresolved sorrow, and where a bleeding portrait was merely the newest, freshest horror in a long, unbroken lineage of creeping shadows. The shadows of the ancient manor lengthened as the late afternoon sun began its slow and heavy descent beyond the moors, casting a pallid and bruised light through the tall, dust-choked windows of the western gallery. Holmes and Watson walked in a quiet and measured cadence across the floorboards, their footsteps offering a hollow percussion that seemed to echo upward into the vaulted ceilings where the darkness was already gathering in thick and undisturbed pools. The air within these decaying halls was heavy with the melancholy scent of rotting tapestries, beeswax that had long lost its sweet lustre, and the pervasive dampness of stone that had stood against a century of unforgiving rains. It was a house that breathed in long and weary sighs, every draught carrying with it the faint and powdery residue of forgotten generations and the unspoken tragedies that clung to the peeling wallpaper like morning frost. Holmes moved with the silent grace of a shadow himself, his long coat sweeping over the uneven floors as his piercing grey eyes took in the myriad fractures in the plaster, the faded outlines where other, perhaps less cursed paintings had once hung in a time before the creeping madness had taken root in the family bloodline. Watson remained close by, a comforting anchor of warmth and solidity, in a space that felt increasingly unmoored from the steady flow of time, carrying with him the faint and familiar aroma of good English tobacco and rough wool. They drifted through the interconnected drawing rooms and abandoned libraries like spirits navigating the purgatory of a forgotten era, listening to the soft and steady rhythm of their own breathing in a house that otherwise felt entirely devoid of life. Their search for answers led them downward, away from the hollow grandeur of the upper floors and into the subterranean dimness of the servants' quarters, a realm of narrow corridors and the profound scent of lye soap, boiled cabbage, and old hearth ash. They found the housekeeper sitting alone in a small and sparsely furnished parlour, a room illuminated only by the hesitant and trembling glow of a single oil lamp that cast her face in sharp and unforgiving relief against the blackened bricks of the unlit fireplace. She was a woman carved from the very same unyielding stone as the manor itself, her hands folded over a grey woolen apron, her pale eyes reflecting the guarded secrets of a lifetime spent observing the slow decay of the noble family upstairs. Holmes spoke to her in a voice that was barely more than a murmur, a gentle and hypnotic cadence that invited confidences rather than demanding them, his words flowing like a quiet stream over the stony silence of the small and suffocating room. He asked her of the nights when the wind howled around the turrets, of the strange and erratic behaviours of the late master in his final months, Sequor, and of the whispers that circulated among the few remaining staff who still dared to sleep within the manor walls after the sun had fallen below the horizon. The housekeeper hesitated, the silence stretching out like a fragile thread, broken only by the rhythmic and relentless ticking of a grandfather clock in the distant hallway, a sound that seemed to count down the remaining moments of peace before the night fully claimed them. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry and brittle rustle, like dead oak leaves moving across a dry stone courtyard in the dead of winter. She told them of a history steeped in a quiet and consuming madness, of a grandfather who had locked himself in the attic rooms decades prior, raving into the empty night about eyes that watched him from the plaster and voices that whispered through the floorboards. She spoke of a profound bitterness that had seeped into the inheritance of the estate, poisoning the affections of the heirs until nothing remained but suspicion, paranoia, and a terrible, insatiable greed that twisted the minds of the men who walked the upper halls. She described the late master as a man who was utterly consumed by the sins of his ancestors, wandering the corridors at midnight with a trembling candle, convinced that the house itself was sitting in judgment of his actions, waiting for the portrait of his forebear to deliver a final and damning verdict. The housekeeper stared deeply into the dying flame of her lamp, her voice dropping to a frail whisper as she recounted the morning they had found the master collapsed beneath the painting, his eyes wide with a terror so absolute that it had stopped his heart in his chest. She did not believe in ghosts, she confessed softly, but she believed entirely in the power of a guilty conscience, and in the sheer and crushing weight of a family curse that demanded payment in blood and sanity. Leaving the housekeeper to her quiet vigil, Holmes and Watson moved further into the labyrinth of the lower levels, seeking out the old butler who had served the family since he was a mere boy in the scullery. They found him in the great kitchens, a vast and cavernous space filled with copper pots that hung like dull and tarnished moons from the ceiling, the air smelling of old paper, dried herbs, and the sharp tang of rusted iron. The old man seemed to exist more as a phantom than flesh and blood, his movements agonisingly slow and deliberate as he tended to the dying fires in the massive iron stoves, either refusing to meet the gaze of the two detectives as they approached. Holmes, with his infinite and practised patience, merely stood beside the old man, allowing the profound quiet of the house to do the work of 1,000 questions, letting the weight of the encroaching evening press down upon the servant's fragile and trembling resolve. Eventually the butler spoke of the young nephew, the one who had been cast out without a single penny to his name, a young man possessing a brilliant but deeply twisted mind, who had spent his lonely youth in the manor experimenting with strange chemicals and mechanical curiosities, much to the profound disdain of his aristocratic elders. The butler whispered of a vow of revenge, spoken in the dead of a freezing winter night by the young man as he was turned away from the heavy oak doors of the manor, a promise that the house itself would eventually weep for the terrible injustices done to him. It was a statement that at the time had seemed to the staff as nothing more than the melodramatic ravings of a disinherited youth, a boy consumed by anger and humiliation, but which now, in the dark shadow of the bleeding portrait, took on a chilling and prophetic weight that hung heavy in the damp kitchen air. The old man recounted how the nephew had vanished into the foggy streets of London, dedicating his life to the pursuit of the sciences, sending back nothing but strange and cryptic letters that the master would immediately cast into the hearth, watching them burn with a nervous and frantic energy. The butler wiped a soot-stained hand across his brow, his voice trembling as he admitted that he sometimes thought he heard the soft and stealthy footsteps of the young man in the walls of the house, a phantom tread that echoed the terrible promises of the past. Holmes listened to every word with his head slightly bowed, his eyes closed in deep concentration, absorbing the tragic history of the family not as a ghost story, but as a complex and tragic tapestry of human frailty, vengeance, and the inescapable consequences of cruelty. As the last remnants of daylight bled out of the leaded windows, swallowed entirely by the encroaching blanket of the moorland night, the manor seemed to undergo a subtle and terrifying transformation, its passive decay shifting into an active and watchful hostility. The gas lamps in the corridors were lit by the remaining staff, their flames hissing a soft and sibilant song against the encroaching dark, throwing wild and dancing shadows that seemed to mock the rigid and solemn portraits lining the walls. The wind began to rise outside, an initially gentle moaning over the heather that slowly crescendoed into a mournful wail, rattling the loose panes of glass in their wooden frames and sending sudden and icy draughts sweeping under the heavy oak doors, causing the flames to gutter and leap in a frantic dance. Watson felt a profound chill settle deeply into his bones, a primal unease that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air and everything to do with the oppressive psychological weight of a house that felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for a terrible tragedy to once again unfold. The very timber of the manor seemed to groan under the pressure of the night, settling and shifting with sounds that mimicked the quiet footsteps of invisible inhabitants, turning the long walk back to the upper floors into an exercise in profound nervous endurance. Holmes, however, seemed entirely in his element, his senses wonderfully heightened, his posture rigid and alert, moving with the focused intensity of a hound catching the first faint scent of its quarry on the biting night wind. They made their way back up the grand staircase, the wooden treads protesting their ascent with sharp and sudden creaks that echoed loudly in the vast and empty foyer, returning at last to the shadowed room where the cursed painting hung in all its morbid and inexplicable glory. The room was steeped in a deep and velvety gloom, the single lamp they carried pushing back the darkness only enough to reveal the heavy velvet draperies, the dust-sheeted furniture that resembled huddled phantoms in the corners, and the portrait itself, staring out from the patterned wallpaper with a gaze that felt piercingly and uncomfortably alive. In the wavering golden light, the painted eyes of the patriarchal figure seemed to hold a profound and sorrowful malice, an expression of silent judgment that bore down upon the room with an almost physical weight, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Watson stood near the doorway, the scent of his pipe tobacco doing little to mask the musty odour of old varnish and damp decay that permeated the space, his eyes fixed on the canvas as they waited in absolute and unbroken silence for the mechanism of the curse to reveal itself. The silence of the room was so absolute that Watson could hear the erratic beating of his own heart, a soft and muffled drum beneath his heavy coat, counting the agonizingly slow passage of time as the chill of the night seeped through the thick stone walls. Suddenly a slow and agonizing tear of dark crimson began to well in the corner of the left eye of the portrait, gathering volume against the painted lid before trailing a slow and deliberate path down the weathered aristocratic cheek of the canvas. The illusion was horrifying in its sheer perfection, the substance thick and dark, catching the lamplight with a wet and viscous sheen that smelled not of old oils and pigment, but faintly of copper, damp earth, and the metallic tang of something deeply unnatural. The droplet reached the edge of the gilded frame, hanging there for a long and breathless moment before falling to the wooden floorboards with a soft and sickening patter, soon followed by another tear welling in the right eye, tracing a parallel path of sorrow and simulated agony down the canvas. Watson took an involuntary step back, his hand instinctively reaching toward the reassuring weight of the heavy revolver in his pocket, a comforting anchor against the encroaching terror of the supernatural. But Holmes merely stepped closer, raising the lamp until its light washed completely over the weeping face. The great detective did not see a wandering spirit or a demonic curse. He saw a puzzle, a mechanical or chemical reality waiting to be gently unspooled from the tangled and messy threads of superstitious fear, his face becoming a mask of intense and unwavering concentration. He brought his face to within mere inches of the bleeding canvas, ignoring the terrible cloying scent of the crimson liquid, his sharp eyes tracing the minutest details of the brushstrokes, the texture of the canvas, and the elaborate twisting carvings of the surrounding wooden frame. The air in the room was completely still, thick with the sweet, almost sickly scent of the fluid that now dripped steadily onto the floor, pooling in the crevices of the dark wood and staining the ancient rug beneath their feet. Holmes reached into his deep coat pocket and withdrew a small and heavy silver magnifying glass, its polished lens catching the golden light of the lamp as he ran it, meticulously along the intricate gilded edge of the heavy frame, his long and sensitive fingers probing the carved vines and wooden leaves with the delicate touch of a safecracker. He moved with a slow and deliberate grace, examining the tiny fissures where the canvas met the wood, tracing the path of the crimson liquid backward to its impossible source, seeking the rational truth hidden beneath the layers of carefully constructed terror. With a sudden and sharp intake of breath, a sound that seemed terribly loud and intrusive in the quiet of the dead room, Holmes pressed a specific sequence of carved wooden rosettes hidden within the floral pattern of the frame. There was a long pause, filled only by the wind howling against the glass, and then a deep and resonant click echoed from within the very walls of the manor, a heavy mechanical sound that vibrated through the floorboards and shifted the heavy atmosphere of the room. A section of the oak panelling directly beside the portrait, a piece of the wall that had appeared entirely seamless and solid just moments before, shifted slightly inward with a soft whisper of hidden hinges and counterweights. Watson moved quickly to his friend's side, his heart beating a heavy and frantic rhythm in his chest, as Holmes pushed his weight against the dark wood, swinging the tall panel open on silent and well-oiled joints to reveal a passage hidden entirely from the world. It was a dark and narrow throat leading into the very bones of the manor, a space untouched by light for untold years, breathing out a sigh of profoundly cold air that rushed into the viewing room and caused the flame of their lamp to dance wildly. The air that rushed out from the hidden space carried with it the unmistakable odours of metallic salts, damp and crumbling plaster, and the sharp, acidic tang of an apothecary's workshop, a precise and chemical smell that cut through the musty decay of the house like a freshly sharpened blade. They stepped slowly through the threshold, leaving the heavy velvet curtains and the weeping portrait behind them, entering a narrow and claustrophobic corridor built into the dark space between the thick inner and outer walls of the house, a secret and forgotten artery that pulsed with the hidden life of the old manor. The passage was incredibly tight, forcing them to walk in single file, their shoulders brushing against the rough and unfinished stone on one side and the smooth, dusty back of the interior panelling on the other. The floor beneath their feet consisting of nothing more than rough wooden planks laid over heavy joists. Dust motes danced frantically in the beam of their lamp, disturbed from their decades of slumber by the intrusion, swirling like tiny glowing phantoms in the freezing air as they moved cautiously toward the end of the short and stifling corridor. There, illuminated by the steady and golden glow of their light, they found a small and meticulously arranged workspace, a chilling testament to a patient and deeply obsessive mind, a hidden sanctuary built for the sole purpose of enacting a slow and agonizing vengeance. The small alcove was filled with a dizzying array of delicate glass tubing, polished brass valves, and precisely carved wooden reservoirs, all arranged upon a small and sturdy oak table that sat directly behind the wall supporting the cursed portrait. Holmes moved to the complex apparatus with the profound reverence of an artist, admiring the masterful work of a rival, his hands gently tracing the lines of a thin and nearly invisible glass capillary tube that ran through a tiny drilled hole in the masonry, directly to the back of the stretched canvas. He showed Watson how the tube split into 2 even finer glass needles, piercing the fabric of the painting at the precise and calculated locations of the painted eyes, so small that the punctures were completely invisible from the front, hidden expertly within the thick layers of dark oil paint. Above this intricate and terrifyingly delicate delivery system sat a heavy glass beaker filled with a dark and viscous fluid, the surface of the crimson liquid perfectly still in the quiet of the hidden room, holding the false blood that had driven a man to his grave. Beside the beaker rested a slow-dripping mechanism governed by a beautiful and complex brass clockwork gear, a device designed to release the liquid at agonizingly slow and irregular intervals, completely independent of human intervention once the heavy mainspring was wound tight. Holmes pointed out in a quiet and melodic murmur how the ambient temperature of the house played a crucial role in the deception, explaining how the cold night air chilled the outer stone walls and caused a subtle contraction in a small metal band wrapped tightly around the reservoir. This tiny, almost imperceptible contraction slightly increased the internal pressure of the vessel, thus forcing the thick liquid down the delicate capillary tubes, ensuring that the portrait only wept its terrible tears when the darkness and the profound cold of night had fully enveloped the manor. Taking a small and pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket, Holmes gently dabbed at the end of a disconnected glass tube, bringing the stained and crimson cloth to his nose and drawing in a deep, long and contemplative breath, letting the scent fill his senses. He explained, his voice echoing softly against the rough stone, that the fluid was not blood at all, but rather a remarkably clever and stable synthesis of iron thiocyanate, a chemical compound that possessed the deep, rich hue and the exact heavy viscosity of human blood. It was a brilliantly sinister concoction that remained perfectly stable over long periods without coagulating, drying out or putrefying, allowing the illusion to be maintained for months without the need for the perpetrator to constantly refill the reservoir or clean the delicate glass needles. It was the undeniable work of a mind that understood both the profound and fragile depths of human psychology and the rigid, unforgiving laws of chemistry, a mind that knew precisely how to weaponize the superstitious dread of an aging and guilt-ridden family to slowly drive them toward the precipice of absolute madness. Holmes spoke softly of the disinherited nephew, the angry youth who had once wandered these very halls in misery, returning years later to turn his exile into a slow, brilliant and agonizing campaign of psychological torture. The nephew had known that his elderly uncle, already haunted by the terrible sins of the past, and the quiet madness that lurked like a shadow in his own bloodline, would view the bleeding portrait not as a mechanical trick, but as a genuine and damning judgment from beyond the grave. The intricate illusion was never intended to kill the old man directly through poison or violence, but rather to slowly erode his sanity, night after night, drop by terrible drop, until the sheer, unbearable weight of his own terror caused his frail heart to simply give out. It was a murder committed entirely without a conventional weapon, an assassination executed by shadows, gears and chemistry, turning the victim's own mind into the instrument of his destruction, while the true killer remained miles away, safely hidden in the bustling anonymity of London. They stood together in the dark and hidden room, the silence stretching out around them like a heavy woolen blanket. The only sound the soft, steady, and relentless ticking of the brass clockwork mechanism on the table. In the dim light, that rhythmic ticking now seemed less like a heartbeat, and far more like the cold, calculating and unforgiving precision of vengeance, a sound that cared nothing for human suffering or the tragic loss of life. The deep and sorrowful tragedy of the family lay completely exposed in the golden glow of their lamp, a sad and bitter tapestry woven tightly from threads of greed, exclusion, paranoia, and a desperate, agonizing need for retribution that had ultimately consumed both the victim and the unseen perpetrator. Holmes reached out with a steady hand and carefully disengaged the small brass lever that controlled the gear, stopping the slow progression of the chemical tears with a final, definitive click that echoed sharply in the small space. In that simple, quiet, and profound action, the terrible curse that had held the manor in its icy and suffocating grip for so many dark months was finally and irrevocably broken, leaving behind only an empty, tragic house and a piece of canvas stained with false and manufactured sorrow. They turned away from the apothecary's bench, their shadows dancing tall and distorted against the rough stone walls, stepping back through the narrow passage and returning to the heavy oak panelling that guarded the secret. They passed back into the velvet gloom of the viewing room, the air feeling suddenly lighter. The oppressive gaze of the portrait now stripped of its supernatural malice and reduced to nothing more than paint, canvas, and glass. Holmes pushed the secret door closed behind them, the heavy wood swinging shut on its silent hinges until it clicked softly into place, blending seamlessly once again into the intricately carved wall, hiding the mechanics of the tragedy from the world once more. The night outside continued its mournful and lonely song, the wind pulling tirelessly at the wooden eaves and the rain beginning to tap a gentle, relentless, and washing rhythm against the tall, dark glass of the windows. Yet, within the room, the crushing and suffocating weight had permanently lifted from the air, replaced by the quiet, settling, and profound peace of a dark mystery gently unravelled, laid bare, and finally put to rest in the quiet corner of the evening. The long gallery of the manor stretches before us like the nave of a forgotten cathedral, steeped in the heavy velvet silence that only the deepest hours of midnight can conjure. Through the tall, mullioned windows, the pale, silvery fingers of the moon reach down to caress the polished oak floorboards, painting elongated, spectral shapes that tremble whenever the wind outside sighs through the ancient elm trees. The air in this corridor carries the faint nostalgic fragrance of dry wood, old canvas brittle paper, and the lingering phantom scent of beeswax candles that have long since surrendered their golden warmth to the cold stone of the estate. Holmes and I wait concealed within the dense tapestry of shadows that pool behind the imposing marble bust of a long-deceased patriarch, our breaths matching the slow, methodical rhythm of the grandfather clock that stands as a silent sentinel at the far end of the hall. Its heavy brass pendulum swings with a hypnotic rhythmic certainty that seems to measure not just the passing of minutes, but the very heartbeat of the slumbering house. The entire manor is submerged in a profound sleep, yet it feels as though the plaster and beams are holding their collective breath, waiting for the grim supernatural weeping to begin anew. Outside, a soft, misty rain begins to patter relentlessly against the leaded glass, weaving a quiet, melancholy melody through the oppressive silence of our vigil. I can feel the smooth, cold brass of my revolver resting heavily within the depths of my woolen coat pocket, serving as an anchor of harsh, undeniable reality, amidst the swirling fog of local legends and terrified whispers concerning the cursed portrait with its bleeding eyes. Beside me, Holmes remains as impossibly still as the suits of armour guarding the alcoves, his sharp, aquiline profile barely illuminated by the faint ambient glow of the stormy night sky, filtering through the rain-streaked glass. He smells faintly of his sharp shag tobacco, and the damp wool of his overcoat, a comforting and familiar presence that grounds my own fluttering nerves in the bedrock of pure logic. We have stood in this dark and quiet for what feels like an eternity, allowing the house to settle into its midnight bones and listening to the tiny invisible sounds of the structure shifting and settling against the cold, damp earth. The portrait in question hangs at the dead centre of the gallery, occupying a place of dreadful honour where the moonlight pools with deliberate intensity over the painted features of the austere 17th century nobleman whose eyes have driven the current inhabitants to the very brink of madness. In the gloom, the oil colours are muted, reduced to shades of charcoal and ash, yet the oppressive weight of the painted stare is palpable, seeming to follow any movement within the room with a silent, malevolent judgment. I find my mind wandering to the terrified accounts of the household staff who spoke in hushed, trembling voices of the fresh crimson streaks that would appear upon the canvas by morning, a gruesome testament to an old curse that demanded a blood penance for the sins of the past. It is a tale designed to chill the blood and twist the mind with fear, but I know that the man standing beside me holds no reverence for phantoms or vengeful spirits, viewing every mystery as a knot merely waiting to be untangled by the deft hands of reason. Holmes does not stir his gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the space just before the painting, a predator waiting with infinite patience for the true monster of the piece to reveal itself from the comforting cloak of darkness. The silence is eventually broken not by the wailing of a ghost, but by the subtle, unmistakable shift of air pressure that accompanies the slow opening of a heavy door somewhere at the far end of the darkened corridor. It is a sound so soft that I might have missed it entirely, had my senses not been strained to their absolute limits, but Holmes perceives it instantly, laying a long, steadying hand upon my forearm in a silent command for absolute stillness. A new scent joins the symphony of old smells in the gallery, the faint sharp odour of kerosene from a dark lantern, followed by the muffled, almost imperceptible scuff of leather soles treading upon the ancient woven runners that protect the floorboards. The footsteps are slow and deliberate, pausing after every few paces to listen to the breathing of the house, a cautious dance of deception, performed by someone who knows these halls intimately and fears the consequence of discovery. A shadow detaches itself from the deeper gloom near the stairwell, moving with a practiced stealth that betrays a thoroughly human caution, entirely devoid of spectral grace. The figure approaches the centre of the gallery, keeping low and avoiding the patches of moonlight that splash across the floor, moving unerringly toward the painted nobleman who waits in silent judgment upon the wall. As the intruder draws near, I can hear the soft, rapid rhythm of their breathing, a sound tight with anxiety and anticipation, mingling with the gentle drumming of the rain against the window panes. The figure raises a hand and the metallic slide of a dark lantern is pulled back just a fraction, allowing a single pencil-thin beam of warm yellow light to strike the surface of the canvas, illuminating the pale, painted face of the ancestor. In this meagre illumination I can see the intruder reach into the depths of a dark cloak, drawing forth a small glass vial that clinks ever so softly against a slender wooden-handled brush. The smell of the gallery is suddenly pierced by a faint, acrid chemical tang, a sharp medicinal scent that entirely banishes the romantic illusion of a ghostly haunting and replaces it with the cold, calculating reality of human artifice. The figure dips the brush into the vial with trembling haste and reaches up toward the painted face, applying a generous coat of a seemingly clear liquid directly over the eyes of the nobleman. Instantly the canvas seems to weep as the clear moisture reacts with whatever invisible preparation has been laid upon the paint, transforming into thick, heavy drops of a deep, horrifying crimson that well up and begin to track slowly down the painted cheeks like tears of freshly spilled blood. It is in this precise moment of macabre triumph that Holmes chooses to spring his trap, shattering the quiet deception of the midnight hour with a sudden sharp scratch of a lucifer match striking against the rough stone of the pedestal beside us. The tiny spark flares into a brilliant, blooming teardrop of golden light, casting our long shadows across the floor and illuminating the shocked, terrified face of the manor estate manager, who spins around with a strangled gasp of pure horror. The glass vial slips from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shatters against the polished floorboards, sending a splash of the clear chemical and a shower of glittering crystalline shards across the wood. I step forward from the shadows, drawing the dark lantern from the man-unresisting grip, and pushing the slide fully open to bathe the gallery in a steady pool of yellow light that mercilessly exposes the trembling form of the orchestrator. Holmes steps out from behind the marble bust, holding the burning match aloft for a moment, before casually blowing it out, leaving the steady glow of the lantern to reveal the pale, sweating countenance of the man who had sought to drive his benefactors from their ancestral home. There is no violence in our movements, only a calm, insurmountable authority that presses down upon the culprit, draining the last remnants of resistance from his posture as he realizes the absolute finality of his capture. Holmes speaks, and his voice is low and resonant, a quiet murmur that fills the gallery without ever breaking the underlying peace of the sleeping house, weaving a spell of pure reason over the shattered remnants of the supernatural terror. He addresses the estate manager by name, his tone carrying neither anger nor malice, but only the weary disappointment of a man who has looked too often into the shallow depths of human greed. "It is a remarkably simple parlour trick, my dear fellow," Holmes explains, his long, elegant fingers gesturing gently toward the weeping portrait where the false blood continues to drip slowly onto the gilded wooden frame. "The canvas was prepared days ago when the family first began to complain of a foul odour in the gallery, an odour you carefully masked with the heavy use of lavender and strong cleaning waxes. You glazed the eyes of the painted gentleman with a fine, nearly invisible dusting of iron chloride, a pale yellow salt that blends perfectly into the aged varnish of the painting, waiting patiently for the catalyst that you applied in the dead of night. The estate manager stares at Holmes with wide, unblinking eyes, his chest heaving as the legendary detective methodically dissects the grand illusion piece, by painstaking piece laying bare the mundane mechanics of the haunting. The liquid in your shattered vial, Holmes continues the toe of his leather boot. Gently nudging a piece of broken glass that sparkles in the lamplight is a simple solution of potassium thiocyanate dissolved in water. To the naked eye, it is as clear and innocent as the morning dew, but when it is introduced to the iron salts resting upon the canvas, a rapid and violent chemical reaction occurs. The two compounds bind together instantly, forming iron thiocyanate, a complex ion that possesses this remarkably vivid, terrifying shade of crimson, mimicking the appearance of human blood with a fidelity that easily deceives a frightened and superstitious mind in the dim light of a flickering candle. It is a trick beloved by stage magicians and unscrupulous spiritualists, relying on the moisture of the liquid to carry the reaction across the painted surface, allowing the blood to well up and run in these dreadful tear tracks, without the need to ever conceal a reservoir of red dye upon your person. I listen to the quiet cadence of Holmes' explanation, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over my shoulders as the impenetrable mystery dissolves into a simple matter of chemistry and calculated deception. The smell of the spilled potassium thiocyanate mingles with the dampness of the rainy night, a tangible reminder of the lengths to which a person will go to manipulate the fears of others for their own selfish gain. Holmes turns his piercing gaze fully upon the broken man, illuminating the dark, twisted motive that lies at the heart of the elaborate charade, an inheritance dispute, a hidden codicil in the old Lord Will, and a desperate attempt to have the rightful heirs declared legally insane and driven from the property. You thought that by resurrecting the old ghost story of the bleeding ancestor you could shatter the fragile nerves of the young heiress. Holmes murmurs softly, his voice as smooth and relentless as the tide wearing away a cliffside. You crept through these halls night after night, playing the part of a phantom, applying your clear liquid and letting the chemistry perform its grisly theatre, all while offering your deepest sympathies and false comforts to the family during the daylight hours. The estate manager offers no denial, his shoulders slumping in total defeat, as the weight of his own guilt and the brilliance of his adversary crush the last vestiges of his pride. He sinks slowly onto a velvet-upholstered bench beneath the windows, burying his face in his trembling hands and letting out a long shuddering breath that sounds like a dry sob in the quiet gallery. The spectral wailing that had supposedly plagued the house was merely the wind manipulated by opening a specific combination of drafty chimney flues, a mechanical symphony of terror orchestrated by a man who knew the architecture of the manor, as well as he knew the contents of its ledger books. I move forward gently but firmly, laying a hand upon the man's shoulder and informing him that he is to remain exactly where he is until the local constabulary can be summoned from the village with the breaking of the dawn. There is no need for restraints or harsh words, for the fight has completely left him, his spirit broken, upon the immovable rock of Holmes' deductive genius and the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. We sit together in the gallery as the hours stretch softly toward morning, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock no longer a sinister countdown, but a comforting reminder of the steady march of time and the restoration of order. The heavy rain outside slowly tapers off into a gentle misting drizzle, and the oppressive darkness of the night begins to thin, replaced by the bruised purple and charcoal grey hues of an approaching dawn. Holmes packs his pipe with a fresh pinch of shag tobacco, the sharp aromatic smoke curling upward into the damp air, masking the lingering chemical tang of the shattered vial, and replacing it with the familiar comforting scent of our Baker Street rooms. The portrait of the nobleman hangs silently upon the wall, the crimson streaks beginning to dry and darken into a rusty brown, losing entirely their macabre vitality and becoming nothing more than ruined paint upon an old canvas. We do not speak much in those twilight hours, content to listen to the house breathing freely once more, the heavy shroud of fear having been lifted from its ancient beams and plastered ceilings. When the first true light of morning breaks over the rolling hills, illuminating the mist that clings to the damp green moors, the manor begins to stir with the innocent sounds of a household waking to a new day. A sleepy-eyed maid enters the gallery with a duster and stops dead in her tracks upon seeing us sitting there with the captive manager, but Holmes offers her a gentle, reassuring smile and a request for a strong pot of hot tea. The smell of the freshly brewed Assam tea soon fills the corridor, mingling with the scent of buttered toast and the fresh, crisp air that wafts in through an opened window, carrying the fragrance of wet grass and blooming heather. The young heiress and her husband arrive in their dressing gowns, their faces drawn and pale from another night of fearful anticipation, but as Holmes quietly explains the events of the evening, detailing the chemical trick and presenting the confessed orchestrator, I watch the heavy burdens of terror melt away from their eyes. They listen in stunned silence as the phantom is reduced to a man with a brush and a bottle of potassium thiocyanate, their fearful glances toward the portrait transforming into looks of profound relief and quiet, righteous anger. The arrival of the local inspector is a brief and businesslike affair, the clattering of carriage wheels on the cobblestone drive signalling the final removal of the dark cloud that had settled over the estate. The manager is led away in silence, his head bowed against the bright morning sunlight, leaving the family to the quiet comfort of their reclaimed home and the arduous task of repairing the damage wrought by his deception. We instruct the staff to gently wipe the canvas with a damp cloth which readily removes the chemical stain, restoring the severe but entirely unthreatening visage of the painted ancestor to its original state. The house feels different now, the oppressive weight of the legendary curse banished by the cleansing light of morning, and the unassailable logic of my dear companion. The grand rooms and winding corridors are no longer pathways for a vengeful spirit, but simply the beautiful aging architecture of a family home standing strong and peaceful amidst the timeless beauty of the countryside. Our departure is handled with the same quiet grace that has characterised the entire affair, the grateful family offering their deepest thanks and insisting upon a hearty country breakfast before we take our leave. Here we eat in the warm sunlit morning room, listening to the cheerful crackle of a fresh fire in the hearth and the gentle clinking of silverware sounds that firmly anchor us in the comforting routines of normal life. Holmes is unusually relaxed, his sharp features softened by the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, and a wrong righted his eyes gazing out across the manicured lawns with a peaceful contentment that is all too rare in our turbulent lives. We gather our coats and travelling bags, the smell of damp wool and leather luggage mingling with the crisp morning air as we step out onto the gravel drive where a waiting carriage stands ready to carry us back to the bustling heart of London. The horses snort and stamp their hooves against the stones, their breath pluming in the cool air, while the driver tips his hat and loads our belongings with a quiet efficiency. As the carriage pulls away from the manor house, I look back through the small glass window, watching the grand old estate shrink against the vast backdrop of the rolling hills and the clearing morning sky. The sunlight catches the tall mullioned windows of the gallery, turning them into sheets of brilliant blazing gold that seem to wave a silent glowing farewell to the men who had restored their peace. Holmes settles back against the squabs of the carriage seat, closing his eyes and drawing a deep, slow breath of the fresh country air, his hands resting lightly upon the head of his walking stick. The rhythmic clopping of the horse hooves and the steady rumble of the wooden wheels over the dirt road provide a soothing lullaby, a gentle counterpoint to the tense midnight vigil we had just endured. We are leaving behind a house healed of its imaginary wounds, a family freed from the spectre of madness, and a mystery neatly unravelled and packed away in the vast orderly catalogue of my friend Brilliant Mind. The journey back to the city is long and peaceful, allowing the events of the night to settle into memory, transforming from a tense and immediate reality into another chapter in the long unwritten book of our shared adventures. I pull my coat a little closer against the chill of the journey, feeling the comforting weight of my notebook in my pocket, where I will soon record the delicate details of the chemical reaction and the tragic greed that fueled it. I will write of the smell of the old varnish, the hypnotic ticking of the grandfather clock, the sudden brilliant flare of the lucifer match, and the quiet, devastating authority of Sherlock Holmes as he banished a ghost with nothing more than the profound, beautiful truth of science. The mist continues to lift from the valleys, revealing a landscape of breathtaking serenity, a world that seems entirely untouched by the darkness and deception we have just left behind. And as the carriage rolls onward, carrying us back to the smoke and clamour of the capital, I close my eyes and let the gentle swaying motion lull me into a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped in the quiet, profound satisfaction of a case completely and perfectly resolved. The soft whispers of the countryside eventually give way to the distant but growing hum of London, the sprawling labyrinth of stone and brick that holds 1,000 more secrets waiting in the shadows. Yet for this fleeting moment suspended between the damp quiet of the moors and the roaring hearth of our Baker Street sitting room, there is nothing but the gentle rhythm of the road and the comforting certainty of a world brought back to balance. The portrait with the bleeding eyes is nothing more than a fading memory, a story to be told in hushed tones around a crackling fire stripped of its supernatural terror and reduced to a quiet testament of human folly and the unyielding light of reason. The evening mist will rise again tomorrow, and the shadows will lengthen across old manor houses, but we rest easy in the knowledge that no ghost can withstand the steady, methodical march of the truth. Peace has returned to the quiet corners of the world, and in this gentle atmospheric silence we find our own quiet sanctuary, ready to face whatever mysteries the next twilight may bring. The carriage wheels whisper against the damp cobblestones as we return to the sanctuary of Baker Street, leaving the mysteries of the dark behind us to dissolve in the pale, creeping mist of dawn. The world outside the glass is washed in the soft, bruised hues of early morning, bringing a profound quiet to the sleeping city. Within our familiar sitting room, the air remains steeped in the comforting sense of ancient paper, abandoned tea, and the faint, lingering warmth of sweet tobacco. The hearth fire, which had crackled so fiercely upon our departure, has now surrendered to the passing hours, dying down to a bed of glowing ruby embers that pulse with a gentle rhythmic heat, throwing long, peaceful shadows across the worn rugs. Holmes does not utter a single word, his restless mind at last finding stillness as he retreats to the quiet alcove, lifting his violin with slow, deliberate hands. He draws the bow across the strings, coaxing forth a soft, melancholic lullaby that drifts like wood smoke through the room, a tender melody that smooths the frayed edges of the night and lulls the waking spirit into absolute calm. As the final notes linger in the still air, settling over us like a heavy protective blanket, I leave you here in this tranquil haven. May the glowing embers warm your thoughts, may the gentle music guide your breathing into a slow and steady rhythm, and may you drift now deeply and quietly into a peaceful and restful sleep.